Hi everybody, Dr. Carolyn Coker-Ross here. How's your day been? Mine has been really hectic. So if you don't mind, before we get started talking about one of my favorite topics, intergenerational trauma and food addiction, would you take a breathing break with me? Let's do it. So just close your eyes if you're comfortable. Breathe in to the count of 4. Breathe out to the count of 6. I'll let you count on your own. And I'm going to do my breathing. Let's do 2 more. All right, let's get started. Breathwork is something you can do anywhere, as you can see. So if you're feeling tense or a little wound up, just take a break like we just did. So as I mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, and that is food addiction and the interaction between intergenerational trauma. So you may not remember, you may not know, but this is the book that I wrote on this very topic. And first I want to just tell you about one of my patients. His name is Chris, and his mother unfortunately died of breast cancer when he was about 9 years old. Chris's dad remarried 1 year later, and his stepmother helped, keep the family together. But she wasn't as warm and nurturing as Chris's mom had been. Some might even have described her as cold. Not mentioning any names here. Chris's older sister took on the role of being the caretaker after their mother died. But, she was a child herself. And she didn't always know what to do or how to handle Chris, who was a very rambunctious, let's say, kid. Chris began to turn to food, unfortunately, out of loneliness and anger when he was in middle school. Even though, he was handsome and smart and good in sports, he often felt isolated and different from the other kids in his school. And I think that's pretty common for kids who've experienced any major traumas at a young age. They don't feel like they can talk to other kids about it, and so they can feel really socially isolated. By the time he was in high school, his classmates were teasing him for being fat. His acting out in school also didn't endear him to his teachers, and he was kicked out of 2 different schools before he finally finished high school. When Chris came in for treatment with me on questioning, he admitted that he binged on a regular basis, often binging on 2 or 3 times what most of his friends were eating. Pizza and steak in particular were his favorites. So he was struggling with stopping that behavior. He wanted to date, but he didn't get out much because he had to have one significant relationship that started when he was about 20 and ended after 5 years. The relationship had been chaotic and difficult, and Chris knew it wasn't a healthy relationship for him, but he still obsesses about his ex-girlfriend, thinking that he let the love of his life go. Now, when he thinks about her, he becomes either, really upset or hyper-focused on stalking her on social media or just obsessing about what could have been. Now, he's run into his ex from time to time, and then he texts her and has trouble not thinking about her all day. So it's almost like a love addiction. Sometimes his obsessive thoughts even interfere with his work, and they can trigger his binges. He has the same obsessive relationship with food, and this has been a problem for him in social situations and also relationships. And even just when he's home alone, he feels bad about himself for eating too much and then promises himself he won't do it again, and then he does, and he feels bad all over again. So the role of stress and childhood trauma, as you can see from Chris's story, any kind of trauma that happens early in life has been identified as a factor in both drug addiction and food addiction. Now, there are links between traumatic stress, any kind of stress that's prolonged, difficult, or where you don't have sufficient support, and substance use disorders. That's well documented. We know about that. The pathway to food addiction is less well established. There's, however, a lot of research going on, and they're using something called the Yale Food Addiction Scale, which has been developed from the substance use addiction scales. So food addiction, or eating addiction as it's often called, is an overwhelming obsession with food, the desire to binge or overeat, especially on highly palatable foods, or what we generally call comfort foods. So that could be pizza, could be mashed potatoes, peanut butter, ice cream, any of those. Individuals struggling with food addiction often feel uncontrollable urges to eat when they are not even hungry. And food addiction affects that part of the brain that's also impacted by substance use disorders. That's called the dopamine reward system. Now, calling this an addiction is not just metaphorical, because recent research has shown that substance use disorders and food addiction both involve the same biochemical processes in the brain, and the dopamine reward center in particular. So there's been a lot of changes in the global food landscape in the past, 4 decades, which has increased our access to convenient foods, fast foods, snack foods. They're everywhere. I remember as a child, we had one McDonald's in the whole city, and now they're on every corner, and then there's more. So we also are cooking less. So we're not preparing foods at home as much, and therefore we're eating foods that are high in fat and salt and sugar. So studies have looked at this effect of comfort foods on the brain and the dopamine reward center. And for example, there was a landmark study that showed that dopamine receptors in the brain were significantly lower in individuals who are living in larger bodies. Other studies have shown reductions in dopamine receptors in the dopamine reward center in people living in larger bodies, and these receptors are called the D2 receptors. It's been suggested that individuals who overeat or binge may be compensating for the lower number of dopamine receptors in the brain, or maybe there's a dysfunction in how those receptors operate in certain people. There are some signs in research that early childhood trauma can be passed from one generation to the next, as we've been talking about, and that has an epigenetic effect on the D2 dopamine receptors in the brain. We're getting down to real anatomy and science in looking at this. Among those with an eating disorder diagnosis, researchers have proposed that the presence of food addiction be conceptualized as maybe an indication of post-traumatic stress disorder. That link between all eating disorders, but particularly between food addiction and trauma, is pretty strong. For example, data from the Nurses' Health Study has shown that severe physical or sexual abuse are associated with a 90% increase in the risk for food addiction. 90%. The same data set also, if you have symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, has shown that you have a higher likelihood of having food addiction. So physical or sexual abuse, 90% increased risk. If you have post-traumatic stress disorder, increased risk for food addiction. Anything you do that gives you pleasure can potentially be abused. We know that. Anything, really. And you can become what we call addicted to it, whether it's food, sex, gambling, drinking, or any other activity that causes pleasure. But if you focus on only eliminating the food, like saying, oh, I'm never going to eat pizza or steak again in Chris's situation, you may feel that you've made a good decision, but you're going to miss out on the deeper form of healing. Obsession with food can take over your life, and it can create distance between you and those you love. And it probably played a role in Chris's breakup from his girlfriend and in some of the chaos that they experienced. If you have food addiction, your first relationship is with that addiction, not with your partner. And you may find yourself so obsessed with food that it can interfere with work or school. But food addiction is not about food, and that's something that people have a hard time understanding. Food addiction is about how you use food. And we know that eating can serve many purposes that have nothing to do with food itself. We eat to manage stress. We may use food to turn up the volume on pleasant emotions, like when we're happy, we're celebrating Thanksgiving or Christmas. Or we may use food to tamp down uncomfortable feelings like anxiety or anger or sadness. If you have a history of trauma in the past, you may eat comforting foods as a way to cope with feelings of fear, triggers from your trauma, or even to relax because the world just doesn't feel like a safe place to you. So what can you do to heal from food addiction? Well, first thing, get my book, and I'm going to tell you more about that at the end. But your struggles with food and eating are not a matter of willpower. It's not your fault. It's not a personal weakness. Thinking of food addiction as a disease of the brain, just like substance addiction, can help you look at things more realistically and not put so much blame and shame and judgment on yourself, because that judgment puts you in a vicious cycle where, you feel bad because you overate, and then you say you're never going to do it again, then you feel bad because you weren't able to keep that promise. That alone, stopping judgment, can make you feel so much better. Rationally, you know that the hollowness of grief, like Chris experienced, or the pain of a divorce, or the brutal trauma of child maltreatment, abuse, or neglect, we can't fill that hole with chocolate cake, even though many of us have tried. A big plate of macaroni and cheese won't truly make you feel safe or loved, or not more than temporarily. But when you've spent years eating for these maladaptive reasons as coping strategies, using food for emotional coping, it can be easy to lose track of the proper use of food. So the process of recovering from food addiction really involves changing your relationship with food and how you use food. So you're going to see a few questions pop up on the screen. I want you to ask yourself these questions, and I encourage you to journal about the answers. See what insights you can get. So what would your life be like without food addiction? Think of what would be missing if you no longer were able to turn to food when you felt bad, or even when feelings of celebration became overwhelming. Number 2, say to yourself, I turn to food whenever I'm feeling, and then fill in the blank. It may be feeling sad. It may be feeling like I need an escape, feeling like a rebel. Those are all common reasons my patients have given me. And finally, number 3, what purpose does overeating or obsessing about food serve for you? And immediately people will say, well, it doesn't serve any purpose. But, the way that the brain works is it doesn't keep doing things that don't serve a purpose. So I want to also just give you the opportunity of getting a free copy of the Food Addiction Recovery Workbook. You'll see on the screen a QR code as well as a link to get this free copy. Now, I pay for the book. I'm asking you to pay for shipping and handling. So there will be a certain small charge, but it's not the full cost of the book. So this is a limited offer. So if you're interested in getting a copy of the Food Addiction Recovery Workbook, please act on this as soon as you see this. And then finally, I have for you the Food Fantasy House meditation. And I hope you're going to find that interesting and helpful. Thanks for listening.
This is the Food Fantasy Imagery. I will be walking you through an imagery, so I'd like for you to get in a comfortable position. Close your eyes if you would like, and take a deep breath. Picture your dream house. Walk up to the house. As you're walking, notice the trees around you. Hear the birds singing and feel the sun on your face. Walk up to the front door and open it. Inside, you find all of your favorite foods. Upon entering, look around and note what you see. If you need support, picture someone or something that could give you support. Feel the presence of that support. You are invited to eat until satisfied. You can leave satisfied because tomorrow you know that you can come back and it will be waiting for you. When you're ready, walk back towards the door and leave the house. Walk away from the house, and again, notice the trees, the flowers in bloom, hear the birds singing, and feel the sun on your face. Take another deep breath, and open your eyes when you're ready. As you reflect on your imagery experience, describe it by journaling about it. Write down what foods were in the house. Who or what was your support? Why did you choose that support? In your experience, were you able to eat until you were satisfied? Did you avoid eating? Did you have a behavior? Did you have any feelings come up at any point during the imagery, such as fear or anxiety? Thank you.